Welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento and welcome. My key area of expertise is on high availability and disaster recovery solutions, specifically on the SQL Server or the Microsoft Data Platform solutions. If you're joining in for the very first time, welcome. The purpose of this series, well, I'm actually starting a new series, but the purpose of these videos is twofold. One, if you're an operator, meaning you're a technical specialist, you're a database administrator, systems administrator sometimes, or even accidentally you happen to be sitting beside a database server and nobody's taking care of it, and now you're responsible for either managing a SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solution, and probably you don't have a clue how to do it, or you're in the process of designing a high availability and disaster recovery solution, but you don't know where to start. Or you already have one, you're managing it, you're struggling because there's so many moving parts. The entire solution is complex and you don't really know which one to look at, especially when you're encountering or you're experiencing some unexpected and unscheduled outage. This is for you. I share not just lessons that I've learned, insights from project work that I did for my customers in the past, even lessons learned that are both positive and negative. We kind of look at it as, yeah, I just need to learn the positive things. No, if I can avoid a mistake that somebody else made, I'll be happy not to do that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with making mistakes. It's just that make new ones. Make mistakes that somebody else have not made yet. I would rather learn from somebody else's mistake, avoid those mistakes, and then try to encounter mine, not intentionally making those mistakes. I mean, especially if you're dealing with mission critical, very highly available infrastructure. I would rather not be, dealing with something like that in a production environment and then I'm making mistakes. Okay, I did say twofold. One, again, if you're a technical operator, this is for you. But it also, if you're in the decision-making role or executive role, maybe you're a database team lead, you're leading a team of database professionals, database administration team, or you're the CTO or CIO, or maybe you're the vice president of technology, and you're looking at evaluating a specific high availability and or disaster recovery solution, and you're looking at not just something to evaluate, but also looking at whether or not this is something that your team can take on, depending on the complexity, depending on how capable your team is. And the way I look at it, high availability and disaster recovery solutions, by definition, they're complex. By definition, they're complex because it's not just one piece of the entire infrastructure. It is everything. Okay, you have to look at it on a bigger picture and not just, hey, I want to protect my database, or I want to protect my database server, or I want to protect my entire database infrastructure. No, it goes beyond that. Okay, I just finished a series on the costs associated with, or the hidden costs associated with high availability and or disaster recovery solution. And it's interesting because part of what I do in my consulting work is talking to customers a lot, and part of that is understanding and asking more questions and just getting myself familiar with the environment, the culture. Yes, because people are a big part of not just building a high availability and or disaster recovery solution, but also maintaining it once it's in production, right? So company culture, processes, the technology in and of itself, and the whole 9 yards. Again, we're not just talking about the database here, we're talking about anything that involves the database, the app, the middle tier, the network, storage, your servers, your virtualization layer. And part of the conversation that I'm having with customers is when a vendor would come in and make recommendations. So I'm starting a new series though that I'm calling Vendor Dilemma. Okay? Vendor Dilemma. And this is when a vendor, and I'm not just talking about third-party vendor, Microsoft is in and of itself a vendor. They sell you, in this case, Microsoft Data Platform solutions like SQL Server or Microsoft Azure or anything around a Microsoft suite of products. They're a vendor, right? VMware is a vendor. Or maybe you're looking at deploying a CRM app, your CRM vendor, okay? Or you're deploying an ERP app, your ERP vendor. But beyond those typical definition of vendors, I also look at stuff like, or not stuff like, consulting companies. They're also vendors. You would come to a consulting company if, let's say, you don't have the capabilities in-house and you need external expertise to come in and help you with something. Okay, they're vendors. Managed services providers fall under that category as well. These are companies that would provide technical expertise to provide you with services, the day-to-day operations, and sometimes outsourcing some of your technical day-to-day when it comes to resolving tickets, addressing problems, and sometimes just bouncing off ideas that you want to implement. That's why I call it vendor dilemma. And those categories, those vendors are part of those. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because I see patterns whenever I talk to customers, like conversations around, oh, we did this because our vendor recommended it to us. Okay? Oh, we implemented this way because our vendors recommended it this way. And I remember one of my very first exposures with this kind of approach was way back 2013. Okay, 2013, and a customer of mine was implementing SharePoint. Yes, I hate to admit it. I did work on SharePoint, on the infrastructure side, that is. I worked on SharePoint end to end, from the front end, middle tier, the back end, everything. And so one of my customers, back then they were implementing SharePoint. They did not bring me in for the SharePoint part of it. They only brought me in for the database part of it. And while we were going through the proof of concept, we were building the different environments. And when I asked, how are we going to build the database infrastructure according to your requirement? The first response to me was, well, we need an always-on availability group. Now, backtrack a bit, a little bit of history. It was around the time that SQL Server 2012 was the time when always-on availability groups was introduced. And surprisingly, there were more documentation written for always-on availability groups on the SharePoint product documentation. Meaning, if you look at some of the documentation around always-on availability groups back then, you would find more about, always ironic, right? You'd find more about always-on availability groups on the SharePoint product team. Okay? And when you look at the documentation, Microsoft will recommend for high availability and disaster recovery, always-on availability groups. Okay? And man, I'm dating myself. When I asked, so why do you want to implement availability groups? Well, it's in the documentation. So that's an example of a vendor recommendation. Okay? And that's why I wanted to start off this new series, because I hear this a lot. In fact, I was just talking to a customer the other day about this specific thing. And then about a couple of weeks ago, when I was at the Microsoft campus doing another a presentation on Azure SQL. Same thing. We are doing this because our vendor recommended it. Okay. In the case of the SharePoint implementation, Microsoft was the vendor. In the case of that attendee that asked the question, it was their ERP provider that made the recommendation. So vendor recommendations. So that's why I call this a series vendor dilemma. Okay. Because I want to also highlight some of the things that you have to be aware of when a recommendation comes from a vendor. This video is all about, if I can make the slides, my slides work, this video is all about asking the right questions, okay? Specifically asking the right questions when it comes to vendor recommendations, specifically on implementing SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery solutions. And again, I'm using that example of the customer who implemented SharePoint. You can think of SharePoint as an app. Microsoft happens to be the vendor. So when you look at an app like that and the vendor is recommending a specific SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solution, you gotta have the right questions to ask. Because here's the thing though, a lot of customers fall into this trap where I'll just take the vendor recommendations as it is. Okay. Real quick question for you though. Was there a time when a vendor simply recommended a SQL Server high availability solution or even a disaster recovery solution, okay, and they made that recommendation based on whether it's documentation, whether it's best practice? I would love to hear your war stories. Type it in the comments because I definitely want to hear more about that. And I'm sure it's similar to some of the experiences that my customers had. So asking the right questions when it comes to vendor recommendations, whenever they're making those types of recommendations for the types of SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. Make sure you have your pen and paper ready. I'm still old school. Take notes. What are those questions that you need to ask when it comes to a vendor making recommendations about your SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions? Let's start with the first question. Ask, does this meet the business's recovery point, recovery time objectives, and or SLA? I'll go back to that story, the customer that I had way back in 2013. They were implementing SharePoint 2013, and Microsoft, because they, again, at that point, it's a new product release in 2013. And so they were getting recommendations directly from Microsoft. Microsoft recommended that they use SQL Server always on availability groups for both high availability and or disaster recovery. Okay? And this is something that a lot of customers fall into this trap of, okay, sure, we'll take it. It's a recommended best practice, or it's a vendor recommendation. I would ask the question, is this solution that you're recommending me or recommending that we implement as part of this solution? So again, using SharePoint as an example. So you want us to implement a SharePoint farm, you got SharePoint and then a database backend. Does this meet our business recovery point and recovery time objective and service level agreement? Okay, because that should be the starting point of every conversation when it comes to high availability and or disaster recovery. And I get it, especially when you talk to vendors whose main goal is to sell, like licenses, right? It makes sense. I would make recommendations because I'm going to make extra money, okay? Without realizing that it may or may not necessarily solve a business problem, or in the case of high availability and or disaster recovery, addressing recovery point, recovery time, and or objectives and or service level agreements. And I'm not just talking about a feature like always on available groups. I'm just highlighting that because that is a well recommended. Always on available group is a well recommended, highly recommended high availability solution for SQL Server. Another example of this is when somebody would recommend something like, okay, all of our SQL Server installations are running on VMs. Let's use VM snapshots or a third-party tool like Veeam, for instance, so we can take snapshots or backups of the entire virtual machine. Makes it a lot easy. Sure, I hear so many great things about it, but I think it would be better if we step back a bit, take a step back and ask, does this meet the business RPO, RTO, and SLA requirements? Okay, because that should always be the starting point of this conversation. I couldn't count the number of times when a customer would come to me, they already have a solution in place, and I would stop and ask the question, what's your recovery point objective, recovery time objective for HA? Yes, I intentionally took a quick, not a long pause, because typically that's the response. Well, ironically, they already have a solution in mind without having a clear definition of what that solution is for. That's why you have to start with this, okay? Start with asking the question. Well, first, of course, you got to be clear on what your recovery point, recovery time objectives are in your service level agreements for HA, which has to be totally different from DR, okay? Has to be totally different from DR. Sure, with HA, a couple of seconds, maybe minutes, especially if it's a mission critical app or a mission critical platform. But DR, you want second automatic failover across data centers. And sometimes this is, again, something that you would have to bring back to the business and be clear first on what the recovery point objective, recovery time objective, and SLA for HA, different from DR. And once you're clear on that, the vendor recommendation on whatever solution that they're recommending should answer the question, does this meet the business requirement? Okay, that's the starting point. Okay, making it clear that it's never about feature, it's never about, sure, we could talk features, we could talk capabilities, we can talk all of these things, but does it meet the business requirement? I use the example of somebody driving a sports car to the grocery store. Sure, if you can afford to buy a sports car, why not? But if your goal is simply, I need transportation from my home to go to the grocery and back, maybe a sports car is an overkill. Maybe it's not a good investment because you want to have a good return. Some people would say, hey, I need to cut down on time to go from my house to the grocery. Of course, but if you're limited by this, there's a speed limit between your house and your grocery store, then driving 120 miles an hour might not make sense. Start with being clear. That's all I'm saying. Start with being clear on what the goal is. And in the case of high availability and disaster recovery, recovery point, recovery time objective, and or SLA, be very clear on that. And anytime a vendor would recommend a solution, ask the question, does this meet the business recovery point, recovery time objective, and SLA? Okay. I've had several customers who run VMware and they implement some form of HA with DR, streamlined using VMware HA and DR solutions. And then the database administration team would come in and say, hey, we need something like always on availability groups. Like, wait a second, before you even implement something like that, let's first ask, is this going to meet the business requirement? Okay, start off with that. Besides, you don't want to be stepping over what you currently have. I've seen cases where somebody had an always-on availability group on VMs, and then somebody is also doing VM snapshots as part of their day-to-day operations, snapshotting the entire VM, and then the enterprise backup team would install agents, and now they're layering one on top of the other because, well, we have it, might as well use it. We paid for it, might as well use it. Streamline it, simplify it, make sure that it first, any solution your vendor recommends meets the business requirements. Okay, that's the first one, and I know I'm spending a lot of time on this because I keep getting customers, or maybe it's me attracting the wrong type of customers, but it's the question that starts off the conversation around the solution that you're trying to implement, which of course your vendors recommend. So that's the first one. Ask the question, does this meet the business requirements? Specifically, recovery point, recovery time objectives, and or SLA. Second question, this one is very important as well, because as I mentioned in the first few minutes of this video, by default and by design, HADR solutions are complex. By their very nature, they're complex. So you have to start asking the vendor, if you're recommending this solution as my high availability and or disaster recovery solution, what else does this depend on? Okay, what else does this depend on? I mentioned Microsoft recommending always on availability groups for SharePoint, for other Microsoft products as well. And if you really understand the different components that form part of an always-on availability groups, you got networking, you got Active Directory, you got DNS, you got storage, implicitly storage, and the entire infrastructure, not even pointing out that those might be sitting on virtual machines, which are now dependent on what your VM admins are doing, and maybe something else underneath the storage configuration. There are a network configuration. There are so many dependencies outside of SQL Server that always on available groups depend on. Another example of this, and I know I'm emphasizing on always on available groups because it's something that vendors recommend. I'm not just referring to Microsoft, even again, ERP, CRM vendors, managed services providers would recommend it. But asking the question, what else does this depend on? Because a vendor recommending always on availability groups without understanding external dependencies that the customer may or may not have would be both an implementation and a management nightmare. By definition, when you look at always on available groups, it depends on Active Directory and Microsoft DNS. Doesn't have to be Microsoft DNS. And so there are customers who would implement non-Microsoft DNS like Unix or Linux DNS. That's not to say it wouldn't work. It's just that it would behave differently when you use a non-Microsoft DNS server. The challenge there is, of course, if the vendor recommends it, it assumes you got all of these dependencies already in place. Okay, and it's interesting again because with a vendor recommendation, they would immediately say, "Do this, implement always on availability groups, and everything else that it depends on." One attendee at the presentation that I did came up to me. They were explaining, our consulting partner, so they hired a consulting company, they brought them in, and part of their goal was to move their app to the cloud. They're on AWS, they moved their app to the cloud. It didn't make sense for their databases to be on premises while their apps are on the cloud. And so what they did was they moved both the app and the database on the cloud. And the company has a mandate to keep data on premises. For one, the data on premises is for internal users that need to generate reports, analytics, decision-making data. Okay, so like analytical processing system, decision support systems. But so they need that. They cannot afford to, because a lot of their apps, internal apps, are on premises. Their public-facing apps are on the cloud. So it didn't make sense for them to have the database is simply on the cloud while their internal apps are on premises. The vendor recommended that they implement distributed availability groups. And they came to me, they asked me the question, so wait a second. So the vendor recommended that you implement distributed availability groups just to bring the databases on premises, because now everything's on the cloud. What does that depend on? Okay, what does that solution depend on? Do you have Azure Active Directory or Entra ID if you've modernized it or called it something else? Or did you stretch out your Active Directory on premises to be available in the cloud? And if you have DNS, did you stretch out your DNS in the cloud? Or are you going to be using Microsoft provided or Azure provided DNS? There are a lot of these dependencies that need to exist from simply having that solution that they're recommending. Okay, so what else does this depend on? Because if those dependencies are not there yet, then you would have to factor in the resources, the investment on top of the solution that they're recommending. Okay, the third question is, does the vendor have the experience? Okay, both on the implementation side and on the supporting side. So I'll go back to that attendee that came and asked me that question. Does this make sense? And that's why I started asking these questions, because the vendor, their ERP or CRM vendor, or app vendor, their app vendor was recommending a distributed availability group solution from AWS to on-premises. The question I asked was, well, other than the fact that, again, I already asked those previous questions where, do you have your internal Active Directory stretched to Azure or AWS? Or, yeah, that was AWS. Why was I thinking Azure AD? Did you have your internal Microsoft Active Directory stretched to AWS? Meaning, have you provisioned a VM that runs Active Directory, and did you stretch that onto AWS? Second, what about DNS? In addition to the question is I asked, so have they done this before? Because here's the thing though, vendors may or may not have the capabilities. They just happen to have read it from another vendor documentation that said, go ahead and do this. Okay? Do they have the experience, the vendor, meaning the vendor? Because they're the ones recommending it. Either your team has the capability to implement it, or they have it, and they're going to help you. Okay? Do they have the experience with implementing it, meaning designing it, implementing it, come up with proof of concept, deploy it in production, cut over to production, and the important thing here is supporting it. Okay? It's not enough for them to have the capability. They need to be able to support it. One customer a couple of months back reached out to me because they had a massive outage. They're a big retail company, global retail company, and their vendor recommended that they implement a 2-node failover cluster with 2 replica always on availability groups. Everything was well. It was the vendor who implemented the solution. Everything was working well. 7 months down the road, they had an outage. Okay? Now here's the thing. It was the vendor who built this thing. Building is easy. You got the failover cluster wizard, you got the availability group wizard, well and good, it's in production, everybody's happy. 7 months later, they had an outage. It was a power failure in the data center, but because their internal team did not have the capabilities, they relied on the vendor who built this infrastructure to do the support. It took them 4.5 hours before they can even bring this entire thing online, which of course is a big, I want to say big problem, because what you thought was supposed to provide high availability took 4.5 hours to bring online. The customer found out that the vendor did not have the capability to support it. Sure, they can build it, but they could not support it. They did not know what to do. Okay? And part of that is also leading to the next question that you need to ask is, who will be responsible for support? Okay? Again, building it is one thing. Again, you bring in consultants, you bring in a managed services provider, or even the vendor themselves. They would help you with the build process. Even if you don't have internal resources who can actually do the work after production cutover, sure, it's fine, everybody's happy, but who's going to be responsible for this? Is it your team, or is it the vendor's team? Because the goal of providing a high availability solution is to make sure that the solution remains highly available. When an outage happens, you are going to look into, one, alerting. Who is going to receive the alert? Is it going to be your team, or is it going to be the vendors? Are they going to be directly managing everything, meaning they would have a VPN access to your data center, they would have admin access to the server, sysadmin privilege to your SQL Server instances, and they could do whatever they want. That's the kind of support that you have to look into. So who is going to get the alert? Who is going to receive the ticket? Who is going to look into the ticket? And are there any expectations about how long will be the time to resolution? Okay, this is no different from deciding, hey, we want to move to the cloud, but now who is responsible for what? If an alert goes off, if I get an email from a monitoring tool, oh, and by the way, is my monitoring tool going to work if I move it to the cloud? Same thing, if the vendor decides, hey, okay, you implement, or we will help you implement the solution, and support comes as a part of that. Are you going to help us implement monitoring for this solution? Because we have our existing monitoring tool. Or are you also going to recommend a monitoring tool that we could use? And if you're making recommendations on a monitoring tool, will you help us implement and then support it? Okay? Again, going back to that story where the customer ended up having a 4-hour outage. Okay, 7 months later, everything was working fine. Then 7 months later, there was an outage. 4+ hours later, that was the only time that the vendor was able to bring the availability group online. What's your SLA? What's your recovery point? What's your recovery time objective? It goes back to the first question. What's your recovery point objective? What's your recovery time objective? What's your SLA for HA? And is the vendor aware of that? And if they're going to support it, can they actually meet those SLAs, those recovery point objectives, and recovery point and recovery time objectives? Can they meet those requirements? Okay, these are the questions that you have to ask when a vendor makes those recommendations when it comes to solutions. And this is something that I get this question a lot, especially from people who have been watching a lot of these videos. They would ask me, hey, for somebody who helps customers manage, implement, and deploy always on available group solutions, you sound like somebody who doesn't like it. Like, no, it's not the point. I would not recommend it just because. For one, I don't get kickbacks for selling Microsoft licenses, so there's no incentive for me. Okay, my goal, and again, one of the reasons why I am doing these videos and these episodes is twofold. One, if you haven't had one already, learn how to ask those questions so that you can decide whether or not it's the right solution for you. Now, if you already have it, okay, you've already deployed an example is always on available group solution and you have to keep it up and running, that's a totally different story. Okay, my recommendation is have the skills, be confident enough to make sure that you can keep the lights on and do troubleshooting, make sure that that's a totally different story. I'm all for helping customers who already have that solution. I'm certainly not going to recommend just remove the solution altogether. I'm not going to do that because they have internal processes in place, and also it would cost more to find an alternative solution. There's immediate solutions for what the business needs at the moment. That's why, again, for most people, they think, oh, for somebody who helps customers with always on available groups, you sound like you don't want them to implement it. I am not going to recommend it until I know exactly what your business needs, what your recovery point objectives are, what your recovery time objectives are, and I would even look at what you currently have. Because if what you currently have is good enough at this stage of where the company is, then stick with what you have. Okay? Keep in mind, if a vendor makes recommendation about a certain high availability and or disaster recovery solution, I'll put that question back. Who is going to be responsible for it once it's in production? Who's going to get the alert? Who's going to monitor it? Who is going to respond? And are they going to meet RPO, RTO, and SLA requirements? Okay, that is key. And this is just, again, this is just the beginning of kind of like the series of topics that I'm going to cover in this whole, I call it the vendor dilemma series, where we are going to be asking questions, looking at, is the vendor making recommendations based on what our company needs, or is it because they just read it off of another vendor documentation and just recommending it to anybody? Okay, that is about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Again, tune in again next week for, I don't want to say part 2 or part 3 or part 4, but it's a series of diving into vendor recommendations and what those recommendations mean from your point of view, what the business, your company's requirements are, and whether or not they make sense. In some cases, they do make sense, but before you even accept vendor recommendations as, we'll take it as it is, we'll implement it, and then we'll worry about it later on, you want to take time to evaluate whether or not it is the right fit for you and the business and the infrastructure. And you're not just looking at it from a database point of view, you have to look at it from an entire end-to-end perspective, where you're looking at the entire infrastructure down to the database level, okay, and all the external dependencies that that solution rely on, like always on available groups rely on, failover clustering, Active Directory, DNS networking, all outside SQL Server. So if you're a database administrator and this is the only thing that you have access to, like the database, well, you can't just take a vendor recommendation knowing full well that you can't do anything about those external dependencies. Okay, yeah, tune in again next week for another episode. I'm still coming up with the next topic for the series, but it really it will revolve around vendor recommendations and the challenges with simply taking in these vendor recommendations. Okay, and if you do need help with, let's say for instance, again, you're in that stage where you need a high availability and disaster recovery solution for your SQL Server databases, and you're not sure about what you need to implement. You're not going to hear always on available groups implemented. You're not going to hear that from me, but rather I would highly recommend that you schedule a what I call strategy session. Use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session where we are going to be doing two things. One, get really clear. And sometimes people were people scheduling these calls would come away saying, I expected you to tell me a solution. All I got from this was I need more questions to ask, because that's the goal. The goal is to get really clear on what problem you're trying to solve, not just to implement a solution. Okay, implementing a solution is easy if you know what goal you're trying to accomplish. So we are going to be doing two things during the call. First is getting really clear on what goal you're trying to achieve, what the business requirements are, meaning getting clear on a recovery point objective, recovery time objective, SLA for both HA and or DR if you need both, and then evaluating what you currently have. And once we're clear on that, we're going to come up with a strategy that fits your requirement, not something that Microsoft recommended or VMware recommended or your CRM, ERP, MSP, consulting company recommended, but something that's specific to your need to meet the business needs at this stage of the business. Okay, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. This would redirect you to my calendar page where you could pick and choose a time that works for you. I don't think I forgot anything, but what was, see, I'm blanking out. I would appreciate, again, your war stories. Share your war stories. Has there been a case where a vendor recommended a specific SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solution, and you regretted doing it after implementing it? I've had several customers who said, we do not even want to touch always on availability groups because we've implemented it and it failed badly, and so we don't even want to get back into it. I would love to hear those stories. Share them in the comment section, and who knows, maybe I am going to cover those specific cases in future videos. Okay, enjoy the rest of your week, or rest of your remaining days within the week, and I'll see you again. Yeah, because why not? You can start an early weekend on a Thursday afternoon, or maybe late Thursday. I don't know. You can start a weekend any day of the week. Totally up to you. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you again in the next episode.